Garrick's punch didn't just shatter my face 11 years ago. It broke the only chain I had left. I am Athelstan. They branded me a burden and left me to die in the Georgian mud, while Rhiannon hissed at me to disappear. Now they stand at my gates, begging for a VIP room, as if the bloodstains on my old Georgian shirt were merely a disguise. I don't scream. I don't resist. I just smile, feeling the cold power of my empire within my grasp, and letting the heavy lock click as their final verdict. I take a slow, steady breath, letting the salty air replace the faint scent of Georgian rain.
The Pacific sun hung low over Carmel by the sea, a bruised orange globe sinking into a horizon of liquid lead. From the balcony of my home, a structure of seamless glass and reinforced steel we called the fortress, the world felt vast, cold, and entirely under my control. I stood there, the salt spray misting against my face, watching the rhythmic surge of the tide against the jagged cliffs below. There is a specific kind of silence that comes with extreme success, a silence that isn't empty, but heavy with the weight of everything you had to endure to earn it. I looked down at my watch, a vintage Patek Philippe. I wasn't checking the time for an appointment. I was feeling the mechanical heartbeat against my wrist, a reminder of the precision I had forced into my life. Tonight was the annual Pacific Heights Charity Gala, and as a man who manages the private wealth of the coast's most influential families, my presence was expected. But standing here, in the deepening autumn dusk, I felt a familiar pull toward the past. People often mistake wealth for vanity, but for me, Athelstan, this house and the millions behind it were never about ego. They were a legal and physical boundary, a moat of steel and firewalls designed to keep the chaos of my youth from ever touching me again. Success isn't about the luxury you can display. It's about how much of your own peace you can afford to protect from those who didn't help you build it. I have learned that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself to move on, but access to your life, your home, and your heart is a privilege reserved only for the worthy. I am no longer the boy who flapped in the wind of other people's temper. I am the anchor. Looking back now, I realize that I didn't just build a career. I built a sanctuary for the soul they tried to crush. I stepped back inside, my leather soles clicking softly against the Italian marble. The interior was clinical, minimal, and bathed in the soft glow of recessed lighting. I walked past the grand staircase toward a dimly lit alcove in the hallway, a space most guests never saw. There, centered on a pedestal and protected by a thin layer of museum-grade glass, sat a single, crinkled piece of paper. It was an unpaid electric bill from a small town in Georgia, dated 11 years ago. The amount due was exactly $14.50. I stared at that faded ink, and for a second, the scent of the California sea was replaced by the humid, suffocating smell of a Georgia rainstorm. I could almost feel the phantom sting in my jaw where my brother's fist had connected. I remembered the hollow thud of my body hitting the mud, and the way the porch light flickered as my sister-in-law told me I was nothing but a burden. 11 years. It felt like a lifetime, yet that bill remained the most expensive thing I owned because it cost me my family. During those first years in exile, sleeping on Greyhound buses and washing grease off industrial dishes until my knuckles bled, I realized a fundamental truth. True strength isn't found in a loud voice or a heavy hand, but in the silence of a man who no longer needs to prove his worth to people who were never looking for it anyway. I had been erased from their history, packed away like an old coat they no longer needed. But in that erasure, I found the freedom to become the ghost of Carmel. I moved through the financial world like a phantom, building a fortress of trusts and anonymous LLCs, ensuring that Athelstan would be a name they heard in hushed tones of respect, but never a face they could reach out and touch. Or so I believed, until the silence of the evening was shattered. The harsh, rhythmic buzzing of the main gate's intercom cut through the villa like a serrated blade. I froze. My security system is top tier. No one approaches the fortress without an invitation. I walked over to the command console in my study, the monitors flickering to life with 4K clarity. At the heavy steel gate, nearly a quarter-mile down the private drive, sat a battered, salt-stained SUV that looked like a relic from another world. My heart didn't race. Instead, it slowed, cooling into a hard, crystalline focus. I recognized those faces instantly. Even through the digital grain and the passing of a decade, the features of Garrick and Rhiannon were burned into my retinas. They looked aged, their skins sallow and desperate, wearing clothes that attempted a middle-class dignity they clearly no longer possessed. They stood outside the vehicle, Garrick banging his fist against the call box with a frantic, entitled energy that made my skin crawl. He looked like a man who believed the world owed him a debt, simply because he had run out of people to bully. I watched them through the camera lens, observing the way Rhiannon adjusted her coat, her eyes scanning the height of my walls with a predatory hunger. They had found me. Somehow, despite the layers of legal shields, they had tracked the burden to his vachda. I felt no fear, only a cold, professional curiosity, like a scientist observing a specimen that had long been thought extinct. Have you ever trusted someone you shouldn't have, only to realize years later that their betrayal was the very thing that forced you to save yourself? I think many of us spend our lives waiting for an apology that will never come, not realizing that our own success is the only closure we truly need. You can't keep the wind from blowing, but you have every right to decide whether or not to open the window. I reached out my hand toward the console. My finger hovered over the audio toggle. I could hear them now, Garrick's muffled shouting, his voice cracking as he demanded I stop playing games and open up. He sounded so small against the roar of the Pacific. I watched his face distort with rage as he looked directly into the camera housing. Slowly, deliberately, I reached for the master control and turned off the audio feed. The monitors remained bright, showing Garrick's mouth moving in silent, pathetic desperation, his fist striking the reinforced casing of my security system. He was throwing a tantrum against a wall he didn't realize I had spent 11 years building, brick by painful brick. I sat back in my chair, the silence returning to the room, and prepared my first move. The digital hum of my study in Carmel faded, as the silence of the room pulled me deeper into the shadows of memory. Seeing Garrick's frantic, aging face on the monitor had triggered a physiological response I thought I'd buried a decade ago. My jaw throbbed with a phantom ache, a sensory echo of the Georgia rain and the metallic taste of blood. I closed my eyes, and the luxury of the Pacific coast vanished, replaced by the suffocating humidity and the smell of wet, red clay. The past isn't a place you leave behind. It's a stowaway that waits for the right moment to make its presence felt. Looking back now, I should have seen the betrayal coming. But at 29, I still believed that family was a fortress, not a trap. The rain in Georgia that night didn't fall, it attacked. It was a torrential downpour that turned the unpaved driveway into a river of mud, reflecting the flickering, sickly yellow light of our decaying porch. I stood there, drenched to the bone, my boots sinking into the silt. In my trembling hand, I clutched a final shut-off notice for the utility bill. It was a measly $14.50. I didn't have it. I had spent my last $20 on a bottle of heart medication for our mother Vera, because Garrick had claimed he was short this month, after a weekend at the tracks. I was shivering, but it wasn't just the cold. It was the realization that the walls were finally closing in on us. Garrick loomed in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the meager warmth of the hallway light. He was a man built of redirected rage and unearned pride, his face twisted into a mask of shame that he desperately needed to project onto someone else. Behind him stood Rhiannon, shielded from the elements by a pristine umbrella, her eyes as cold as the rainwater dripping off the eaves. She didn't look at me with concern. She looked at me like a line item that needed to be deleted from a ledger. Have you ever stood before the people who were supposed to love you and realized you were being weighed and found wanting? Sometimes, the deepest wounds aren't made by enemies who hate you, but by the brothers who once promised to protect you. The power's going out, Garrick, I said, my voice barely audible over the thunder. I bought the medicine. I couldn't cover the bill. I held out the crinkled paper, hoping for a moment of shared struggle, a sign that we were in this together. Instead, Garrick stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under his weight. He didn't look at the notice. He looked through me, his eyes glassy with the kind of resentment that only grows in the soil of one's own inadequacy. He needed a villain to explain his own failure to provide, and I was the only one left in the house to play the part. That was where the erosion of our brotherhood reached its final, jagged edge. The violence, when it came, was sudden and clinical. There were no shouts, no dramatic warnings, just the sharp, sickening sound of a fist connecting with bone. Garrick's strike was fueled by a decade of Rhiannon's whispers, a slow-acting poison that had convinced him I was the anchor dragging his life into the mud. My head snapped back, the world spinning into a kaleidoscope of gray rain and yellow light. I hit the porch floor hard, the rough wood scraping my skin, before sliding off into the wet clay. The taste of copper filled my mouth, warm and thick. I looked up from the dirt, blinded by the rain, seeing my own brother standing over me like a victor on a battlefield that didn't exist. Rhiannon didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her umbrella perfectly positioned to keep her dry while she delivered the verbal execution. "Get lost, Athelstan," she said, her voice a low, terrifyingly calm hiss. "You've always been a useless idiot, a burden we've had to carry while we tried to make something of this family. We will never rise as long as you are dragging us down into the gutter. Don't look back, don't call, you're erased." It was a declaration of war disguised as a house cleaning. In that moment, I understood that I hadn't just been kicked out of a house. I had been stripped of my humanity by the only people I had left. I lay there for a heartbeat, the rain washing the blood from my lip and mixing it with the Georgia mud. I could have fought back. I was younger, and despite the shock, I was stronger. But as I stared at Garrick's trembling hands, I realized that violence is the last refuge of the incompetent. To strike him would be to acknowledge that I belonged in his world of petty rage and broken promises. My dignity was the only currency I had left, and I wasn't going to spend it on a man who had already declared me bankrupt. I didn't realize it then, but that moment of absolute silence was the greatest victory I would ever win. I picked myself up slowly, my joints aching and my vision blurred. I didn't beg. I didn't ask for my clothes or the few books I owned. I simply wiped the blood onto my sleeve and began walking down the long, unlit driveway. Every step away from that porch felt like a link in a heavy chain snapping. Behind me, the front door slammed shut, a hollow, final sound that echoed through the trees like a gavel. It was the sound of a legal and emotional contract being voided. I was 29 years old, standing on a Georgia back road in a storm, and for the first time in my life, I truly had no one. The best revenge isn't to mirror the cruelty of those who hurt you, but to become a version of yourself they can no longer reach. As I reached the main road, the headlights of a passing car cut through the darkness like a searchlight, illuminating the rain-slicked pavement. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I could never go back. I was leaving Georgia with nothing but a broken heart and a debt I never actually owed. The silence of the night was terrifying, but it was also a blank slate. I had been discarded like trash, but trash is often just something whose value the owner was too ignorant to understand. I stood by the shoulder of the road, the cold water soaking into my skin, and made a silent vow to the man I would eventually become. I would build a life so high and so strong that their voices could never reach the windows. I wouldn't seek their blood, but I would seek my own peace. I didn't know what was waiting for me next. The Greyhound stations, the industrial sinks, the years of invisibility, but I felt a strange, chilling clarity. I had survived the Georgia rain. Everything after this would just be weather. I looked into the distance, toward the lights of the next town, and realized that while I was bleeding, I was finally, dangerously free. On the 4K monitor, the image of Garrick and Rhiannon remained, a jagged intrusion into the peace I had spent a decade perfecting. I leaned back in my leather chair, my knuckles still white from gripping the armrests. I hadn't spoken yet. I chose instead to watch, to observe the decay of their character through the clinical lens of a high-definition security camera. Time doesn't change people, it merely unmasks them. When the world stops feeding the ego, the predator finally shows its teeth, and I was looking at two very hungry wolves. I reached out and flicked the toggle for the two-way audio, but I kept my own microphone muted. I wanted to hear the raw, unfiltered desperation of the people who once called me a burden. Garrick was shouting into the call box now, his face inches from the camera. The high-resolution lens captured every broken blood vessel in his nose, every wrinkle of failure etched around his eyes. His voice was a pathetic mixture of forced bravado and the genuine terror of a man who knows the bill has finally come due. He looked like a stranger wearing my brother's skin, a man who had traded his soul for the approval of a woman who was currently pushing him aside to fix her hair in the reflection of my security glass. Rhiannon took over the intercom, still trying to project the image of the Georgia queen she once pretended to be, even though her coat was frayed at the cuffs and her eyes were darting around like a cornered animal. She began to speak as if we were merely in the middle of a minor family spat, her tone dripping with that artificial southern sweetness that always preceded a strike. Athelstan, darling, we know you're in there, she cooed, though the tremor in her hands told a different story. Garrick's sugar is low, and we've had such a long drive. Be a dear and let us in so we can put all this unpleasantness behind us. I maintained my stoic posture, a statue of cold resolve, refusing to let the ghost of the Georgia rain dampen the dry, expensive warmth of my California life. Have you ever looked at someone who once had the power to destroy you and realized they are now entirely at your mercy? It's a strange, hollow sensation, not quite joy, but a profound sense of cosmic alignment. I think we spend so much time fearing the monsters of our past that we forget they are just as fragile as anyone else once you stop giving them permission to hurt you. Rhiannon's tone shifted when I didn't respond immediately. She held up a crumpled copy of a high-end financial journal to the camera lens, pointing aggressively at a grainy photo of me at a venture capital summit in New York. "We saw the article, Athelstan. We know who you are now," she snapped, her mask finally slipping. She admitted, with a terrifying lack of shame, that they had spent their last few $100s on a private investigator to track my new legal name to the deed of this villa. They hadn't come for a reunion. They had come to collect on a debt they believed I owed them by birthright. Garrick's plea shifted then, losing the "I missed you" facade and turning into something much darker. "You owe us, little brother," he growled into the microphone. "Family stays together. We lost the Georgia house, foreclosure, the banks, those vultures. We're homeless, Athelstan. You're living in a castle while your own flesh and blood is sleeping in an SUV. It's not right." I felt a brief, stinging pang of pity, not for their loss of property, but for their utter lack of character. He who expects a harvest from a field he burnt to the ground is not a victim. He is a fool. They had set fire to our bridge 11 years ago, and now they were complaining that the water was too cold to swim. Rhiannon, sensing my silence as a sign of my old, perceived weakness, began to bark orders as if she were the mistress of the house. "Enough of this, Athelstan. Prepare the VIP guest suite, the one with the ocean view, and tell your staff to have a hot meal ready. We've had enough of this drama. We are staying until we get back on our feet, and that's final." I watched Garrick nod in agreement, his entitlement so thick it was almost suffocating. They truly believed that the Georgia punch and the 11 years of silence were just minor inconveniences that my money should now erase. They were parasites who had found a host, and they were already measuring the curtains. I looked down at my smartphone, checking the legal standing. The "private property, no trespassing" signs were clearly illuminated by the floodlights, and my cloud-based security dispatch was on high alert. In California, the law is very clear about the sanctity of a private residence, and I had built this place to be an ironclad legal fortress. I took a deep, steady breath, feeling the air fill my lungs, the air of a man who had built his own world from nothing. I finally leaned into the microphone, my voice a low, terrifyingly calm velvet that seemed to vibrate through the intercom at the gate. "Rhiannon, Garrick," I said, and I saw them both freeze at the sound of my voice, a voice that no longer held the tremor of the boy they had bullied. "I've been listening. I've heard everything you've said about family, about debt, and about guest suites." I paused, letting the sound of the Pacific waves fill the silence between us. "But tell me something. Before I decide what to do with you, do you truly believe a key to my house exists for those who spent a decade locking me out of their hearts?" I watched Rhiannon's practiced smile falter, and then completely vanish as she realized the boy who used to beg for their love had been replaced by a man who didn't even need their apology. The silent monitors in my study continued to broadcast the frantic motions of the two people who had once defined my world. Seeing Rhiannon's mask of southern charm crumble into a jagged display of entitlement was the final confirmation I needed. I didn't feel the heat of anger, nor the cold chill of fear. I felt a profound, heavy clarity. The boy who had bled in the Georgia mud was truly dead, and the man standing in this Carmel villa owed nothing to his ghost. I realized then that my 11-year journey wasn't just about accumulating wealth. It was about accumulating the sovereignty to say no to the people who never thought I was worth a yes. I stepped out onto the wide glass balcony, the California sun reflecting harshly off the polished steel railings. From this height, I looked down at the driveway, watching the tiny drama unfold at the gate. Below, Garrick let out a muffled cheer, misinterpreting my appearance as a sign of surrender. He began hauling a battered suitcase from the trunk of the SUV with a renewed, frantic energy. He was already moving in, his mind likely calculating which room was the largest and where he could park his pride. It was a pathetic sight, a man attempting to occupy a life he had done everything in his power to prevent me from having. Rhiannon was already playing the part of the lady of the manor. She stood near the call box, barking directions toward the house at an imaginary staff, her eyes scanning the glass walls of my home with the naked hunger of a vulture. She didn't see a home. She saw a carcass to be picked clean. I watched Garrick's aging, desperate face from my vantage point. I thought of the medicine I had bought for our mother 11 years ago, a quiet act of love that was met with a punch in the face. True kindness isn't allowing a fire to consume your home just because your brother held the match. It's building a house that can no longer be burned. Have you ever noticed how people only remember family when they need a place to stay, but forget it when it's time to show respect? We all want to believe in second chances, but there's a difference between a mistake and a pattern. What would you do if the people who broke you suddenly arrived, demanding you be the one to fix them? I looked at my hands, steady and clean, and realized that my mercy belonged to those who cherished it, not those who viewed it as a weakness to be exploited. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone, the high-tech security app already open. On the screen, the master lock icon glowed a soft, inviting blue. Below me, Garrick stood at the threshold where the heavy steel panels met, reaching out his hand as if the house would open to him by the divine right of blood. I offered him a small, genuine smile, a smile not of malice, but of profound pity for the smallness of his soul. I knew then that my dignity was worth more than 1,000 biological obligations. I tapped the screen. Under California property law, I was securing a private residence against unauthorized intruders, and I had every legal right to do so. The heavy, automated steel gate began its slow, rhythmic slide. The high-end motor hummed with a precision that mocked the chaotic, screaming demands rising from the gravel below. Garrick's eyes widened as the gap began to close, his suitcase dropping from his hand as he realized the burden wasn't opening the door, he was sealing it. I leaned into the balcony's hidden microphone, my voice steady and amplified through the gate's speakers. "I don't hold a grudge for the Georgia rain, Garrick," I said, my words carrying over the sound of the Pacific surf. "I simply learned how to build a roof. You are not my burden anymore, because I have finally chosen to be my own strength." Garrick's frantic knocking against the steel panels was a hollow, tinny sound compared to the roar of the ocean behind me. Looking back now, I should have felt some grief, but all I felt was the quiet, terrifyingly beautiful sensation of being free. The gate hit the magnetic lock with the resounding, heavy metallic clank of a gavel. In an instant, the security LED strips along the driveway turned from a welcoming white to a solid, warning crimson. The barrier was complete. Below, Garrick kicked the steel in a silent tantrum, his screams for family muffled by the wind coming off the cliffs. Rhiannon stood frozen, staring directly into the camera lens, her mask of fake love finally disintegrating into a pure, ugly resentment that she could no longer hide. I turned away from the balcony and stepped back into the cool, silent interior of my foyer. I stood there for a moment, looking at my own hands. These were the same hands that had once scrubbed industrial grease and bled in a Georgia sink, but today they were the hands of a man who belonged to himself. You cannot invite peace into your home while the door remains open to those who profit from your pain. Athelstan was no longer a name on a foreclosure notice. It was the name of the man who owned the gate. I walked toward my office, already preparing to make a call to the private hospice where I had secretly moved our mother months ago to protect her from Garrick's debt collectors. Just as the silence of the house settled back into its comfortable rhythm, my phone vibrated in my palm. It was an urgent notification from my private security firm. Someone was attempting to bypass the villa's digital firewall from a location only miles away. The fight wasn't over. They were moving from the gate to the wires, and they were about to learn that my digital walls were even thicker than my steel ones. The red alert on my console was more than just a security breach. It was a digital declaration of war. Someone was attempting to penetrate my private servers from a localized IP address, likely a burner device sitting in that salt-stained SUV at my gates. It's funny how people who call you useless are always the first to try and steal what you've built. I sat in the dim light of my study, the only sound the faint hum of cooling fans and the distant rhythmic pounding of the Pacific surf. I didn't panic. Panic is a luxury for those who don't have a plan. I simply watched the code scroll by, realizing that while they were trying to pick my digital locks, they had left the front door of their morality wide open. Looking back now, I should have realized that Rhiannon's desperation would drive her to a level of depravity that even I hadn't anticipated. Outside, the afternoon light was dying, swallowed by a thick gray fog rolling in from the ocean. It was a suffocating mist that blurred the lines between the cliffs and the sky, turning my fortress into an isolated island. I shifted my attention back to the security monitors, and that's when the theater began. Rhiannon appeared on the screen, rolling a wheelchair toward the center of the gate's camera arc. In the chair sat a woman, frail and slumped, draped in heavy wool blankets despite the humidity. Her face was partially obscured by a headscarf, but her posture screamed, dying. Rhiannon leaned into the intercom, her voice now a shrill, piercing weapon that cut through the foggy air. "Athelstan, look at her! Look at your mother, Vera!" she shrieked, her face twisted into a mask of performative grief. "She's freezing, Athelstan. She's caught pneumonia because you're letting her sit in this coastal rot like a dog. Is this how you treat the woman who gave you life? Open this gate before her blood is on your hands." I felt a surge of cold fury, not because of the accusation, but because of the sacrilege. I zoomed the 4K lens in until I could see the woman's neck. There were creases of stage makeup, heavy theatrical contouring used to simulate the sunken skin of the terminally ill. The cruelest lie isn't the one told with words, but the one that wears the face of love to commit a robbery. Have you ever seen someone use the person you love most as a pawn in a game of greed? It's a moment that changes you. It strips away the last remnants of shared history and leaves only a cold, hard clarity. If you've ever been manipulated by someone using your own heart as a weapon, you'll understand why my response wasn't a scream, but a calculated silence. I knew the truth. My real mother, Vera, was currently 500 miles away in a private, high-security medical facility, sleeping in a bed I had paid for with my own sweat. This woman in the wheelchair was a ghost, a paid actor in Rhiannon's desperate play. The performance shifted then, moving from the intercom to the digital world. Garrick stepped into the frame, but he wasn't looking at the house. He was holding his smartphone out like a holy relic, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of the screen. "Look at the billionaire," he shouted, his voice booming as he started a live broadcast to his social media followers. "Look at Athelstan Tyrell. He's a monster. He's sitting in a glass palace while our sick mother dies at his doorstep. Share this. Let the world see what a heartless coward he is." The view count on the stream began to explode, a digital wildfire fueled by the internet's love for a villain story. Rhiannon played her part perfectly for the live stream, kneeling by the wheelchair and sobbing into the blankets. "Please, Athelstan, just a room, just a bed for her," she wailed, her eyes periodically checking the phone's screen to see the engagement numbers. My legal team began pinging my personal device, their messages urgent. PR disaster in progress. Reputational damage reaching critical levels. Should we issue a statement? I ignored them. I didn't want a statement. I wanted the evidence. Truth is like the sun. You can shut it out for a time, but it ain't going away. I sat back and let the stream run, watching my brother strike my gate with a heavy crowbar, each blow recorded in high definition from 4 different angles. I began to move then, not with haste, but with the surgical precision of a man who had already seen the end of the board. While Garrick was busy performing for a few thousand strangers, I was gathering the digital counteroffensive that would dismantle his life. I pulled up an encrypted folder on my terminal, a file I had been building since the moment that SUV entered my zip code. It contained 4K footage from my covert long-range perimeter cameras. Cameras they didn't know existed because they were hidden half a mile down the road. The footage showed everything. It showed Rhiannon's SUV stopping at a local extras and talent agency earlier that morning. It showed her handing a stack of 20s to a woman who looked vaguely like our mother. It showed them applying the sick makeup in the backseat of the car while Garrick practiced his angry monologue. It was a complete storyboard of extortion. I watched Garrick's red, distorted face on the live stream, and for a second, I felt a wave of genuine pity. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary, but for some, it's just a mask for their own failures. I wasn't protecting my money anymore. I was protecting the sanctity of my mother's name and the peace I had bled for in the years of my invisibility. I watched the view count on Garrick's stream hit 1 million. He was triumphant, laughing as he prepared for a final, heavy swing at the gate's electronic housing. He thought he was breaking me down in the eyes of the public. He thought he had found the one lever that would pry open my fortress. I reached for my phone and made a single call. I didn't call the police. I didn't call my publicist. I called the CEO of the local talent agency, a man who owed his recent expansion to an anonymous investment fund I controlled. "Jerry," I said, my voice low and steady, "I'm looking at one of your contractors on my front lawn. She's currently pretending to be a dying woman for a fraudulent live stream. I want the signed contract for this gig on my desk in 5 minutes, or your agency is bankrupt by sunset." I watched the screen as Garrick raised the crowbar high, his face twisted in a snarl of unearned victory. He didn't realize that while he was busy trying to break into my house, I had already dismantled the very ground he was standing on. The crowbar descended, but before it could hit the steel, the silence of the fog was broken by a sound he hadn't planned for, the sound of his own lies coming home to roost. The night had finally claimed Carmel by the sea, but the darkness was hollow, filled only with the artificial glow of my security floodlights and the toxic noise of Garrick's lies. Inside my command center, the air was cool and smelled faintly of ozone from the servers. I watched the viral metrics on the secondary screen. 3 million people were now tuned into the tragedy unfolding at my gates. The comments section was a battlefield of misplaced righteous indignation, calling me a monster, a cold-blooded elite. I didn't feel the sting of their words because I knew they were watching a movie directed by a master of deceit. I sat with a terrifyingly calm precision, coordinating with my legal team to finalize the response packet. We had everything: time-stamped 4K footage, signed affidavits, and the paper trail they thought I'd never find. A lie can travel halfway around the world, while the truth is putting on its shoes. But once the truth starts walking, it never stops. I chose not to react to the digital noise. My sister-in-law Rhiannon believed she was winning because she had the crowd's attention, but she had forgotten that attention is not the same as evidence. Looking back now, I realized that the silence I maintained wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the quiet of a trap being set. I leaned into the microphone, my finger hovering over the switch that would activate the exterior projection system. "Garrick, Rhiannon," I said, my voice echoing off the cliffs and cutting through the sound of the surf. "You've given the world a very moving performance tonight, but every play has an ending." I hit the master switch. Suddenly, the darkness of the driveway was obliterated by stadium-grade floodlights, a brilliance so intense it turned the foggy night into high noon. The woman in the wheelchair squinted, pulling the blankets tight as she tried to hide her face from the unforgiving light. "Rhiannon," I continued, my voice cold and surgical, "that woman in the chair is wearing 11-year-old clothes I recognize from a thrift store bin in Georgia, but she isn't my mother." I activated the massive exterior projection screen that I used for summer movie nights. Instead of a film, it displayed a live, secure video feed. There, in a peaceful, sun-drenched garden at a luxury hospice in Northern California, sat the real Vera. She was talking softly to a nurse, a glass of fresh juice in her hand, her face serene and untouched by the chaos at my gate. Have you ever seen a lie dissolve in real time under the weight of an undeniable truth? It is a visceral, haunting thing to witness. I think we often forgive family out of habit, but there is no habit strong enough to excuse the sacrilege of using a parent as a weapon. Loyalty isn't about blood on a birth certificate. It's about the hands that hold you when you're falling, and my brother's hands were only built to push. I hadn't abandoned our mother. I had rescued her from the very debt-ridden wreckage they had created. The collapse of the narrative was instantaneous. On the live stream, the viewers, the same ones who were calling for my head minutes ago, began to turn on Garrick in real time as they saw the two screens side by side. The actress Rhiannon had hired, realizing that California's elder abuse and fraud laws carried heavy prison time, didn't wait for the script to finish. She stood up from the wheelchair, discarded the blankets, and fled into the fog toward the main road, leaving Rhiannon standing alone in the middle of the driveway. Garrick dropped the crowbar. The heavy iron hit the gravel with a hollow thud that sounded like a funeral bell. He stared at the projection of our mother, seeing her well cared for and peaceful, and I saw the final, shattering realization of his own failure break him. My legal team was already blasting the cease and desist orders to every major news outlet, accompanied by the unedited footage of Rhiannon hiring the talent earlier that day. The "Evil Billionaire" headline was flipping to "Elite Extortion Attempt," faster than Rhiannon could breathe. You cannot build a kingdom on a foundation of lies and expect it to survive the first sunrise. I watched through the camera as Garrick sank to his knees in the gravel, his phone, still broadcasting his own ruin, lying forgotten in the dirt. He looked so small beneath the towering walls of the fortress. Rhiannon was pacing, her phone pressed to her ear, likely calling a lawyer who would tell her she was finished. The high-stakes game they had played was over, but they had forgotten that I wasn't just defending a house. I was defending a life they had declared worthless. My head of security whispered into my earpiece then, his voice a professional monotone. "Athelstan, the Monterey County Sheriff is 2 minutes out. They're coming up the private drive now." I nodded, watching the flickering blue and red lights appear in the distance. The Nen of the last few hours was finally beginning to thaw. I felt a profound sense of catharsis, but I wasn't done. The physical gate had held, and the digital gate had held, but the final legal blow was still waiting in the wings. "Wait," my security lead added, his tone shifting slightly. "There's a wire transfer notification on your private terminal. You need to see this before the deputies arrive." I turned toward the screen, seeing a confirmation of a transaction I had authorized weeks ago, long before they ever knocked on my gate. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the one that would turn their temporary defeat into a permanent closure. I looked back at the monitor, seeing my brother's broken figure in the dirt, and prepared to step out and end this once and for all. The fog had completely retreated, leaving the night sky over Carmel by the sea sharp and crystalline. Looking up, the stars felt like cold observers of the wreckage scattered across my driveway. I stood in the foyer of the fortress, watching the monitor one last time. Seeing Garrick slumped in the gravel, the same man who had once stood tall in the Georgia rain to strike me down, didn't bring me the rush of vengeance I might have expected as a younger man. It brought something much heavier, the profound, quiet satisfaction of a long-term plan reaching its natural conclusion. I took a final sip of water, checked the digital confirmation on my screen, and prepared to step out into the night to end this cycle once and for all. The air outside was brisk, carrying the sharp scent of salt and pine. As I walked down the long, illuminated driveway toward the gate, my footsteps were the only sound in the stillness. I didn't open the steel barrier. I stopped just inches from it, looking through the bars at the brother who had discarded me 11 years ago. Garrick looked up, his eyes bloodshot and hollow, his hands trembling as he realized the police sirens were no longer a distant threat, but a nearing reality. I reached through the bars and handed him a thick, leather-bound legal folder. It wasn't a gift of money, it was a record of his own history. "I didn't just ignore you for 11 years, Garrick," I said, my voice low and steady, cutting through the ocean breeze. "I monitored you. I watched as you and Rhiannon burned through every bridge and every dollar. I watched his hands shake as he opened the first page, seeing the letterheads of banks he thought had forgotten him. I didn't buy your defaulted mortgage and your personal debts through a holding company to punish you. I bought them so you could never sell your lies to anyone else again. Under U.S. law, I wasn't just his estranged brother anymore. I was his primary creditor. I was the owner of his past mistakes and his future liabilities. Have you ever realized that some people only value you when they can no longer afford to lose you? We spend our lives hoping for a change of heart, but sometimes the only way to find peace is to take the keys to the kingdom out of the hands of those who would see it burn." I looked Garrick in the eye, seeing the man who had called me a burden. "You've spent a decade living off the grace you didn't know I was providing," I told him. "While you were busy hating my memory, I was busy making sure our mother never felt the sting of your bankruptcy. I was the ghost who kept the lights on in her life while you were trying to blow them out in mine." The blue and red lights of the Monterey County Sheriff's cruisers finally crested the hill, their reflections dancing off the glass walls of my villa. The silence was replaced by the professional, urgent hum of justice. The deputy stepped out, assessing the shattered camera housing and the crowbar lying in the dirt. Rhiannon began to wail, a shrill, desperate sound that attempted to pull the officers into her web of victimhood. But my attorney was already there, stepping out of the shadows with the pre-signed no trespassing injunctions and the certificates of debt holding. In this zip code, paper speaks louder than screams. I watched in silence as the deputies escorted them toward the cruisers. There were no handcuffs. I hadn't asked for that. But there was the absolute finality of an escort off my land. As Rhiannon passed me, Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated resentment. But for the first time in my life, her gaze had no weight. She was just a cornered strategist who had run out of moves. Athelstan was no longer a name she could weaponize. It was a wall she could never climb. Compassion isn't about what the other person deserves. It's about who you choose to be, even when you're being pushed to the edge. "Wait," I told my attorney as the cruisers prepared to pull away. I handed him a small envelope. "Give them this. It's a stipend for a modest hotel and a bus ticket back east. My debt to the boy I used to be is paid, but I won't let them say I left them with nothing." I watched the red taillights disappear down the drive, realizing that my brother wasn't an enemy to be destroyed, but a lesson that had finally been concluded. The Nen of the last decade had finally fully leaving me with a lightness in my chest that felt like a new kind of gravity. I returned to my study and picked up the phone, calling the secure facility 500 miles away. I didn't wake my mother. I just sat there in the dark, listening to the soft, steady rhythm of Vera's breathing through the monitor. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, the sound of safety. I walked back to the alcove and looked at the framed Georgia electric bill. I had thought about burning it tonight, but I changed my mind. I would leave it right where it was. It was a testament to the boy who was once a burden, and the man who had the strength to become a fortress for those who truly mattered. The hardest gate to lock isn't made of steel or guarded by 4K cameras. It's the one in your own mind that lets the ghosts of the past back in. Tonight, as I stood in the center of my home, I realized that I was finally, truly home. I stepped back onto the balcony, the Pacific air now warm and welcoming. I was no longer defined by a punch in the rain or a sister-in-law's vitriol. I was Athelstan, a man who had built his own peace from the mud of Georgia and the glass of Carmel. I thought of all of you out there who have been discarded, who have been told you are a gan nunk by the people who should have carried you. To you, I whisper this into the salt air. They didn't break you. They just forced you to find the strength to build a wall they will never be tall enough to climb. You are not the trash they threw away. You are the treasure they weren't smart enough to keep. I took a deep breath of the midnight air, turned off the lights, and let the sound of the ocean fill the house. The story of the boy from Georgia ends here, but the life of the man in Carmel has only just begun. Looking back, I've learned that setting a boundary isn't an act of hate. It's the ultimate act of self-respect. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for a toxic family is to finally stop being their burden by becoming your own hero. My fortress wasn't built for revenge. It was built for the peace I deserved. I know many of you have stood in the rain, waiting for an apology that never came. I want to know, what was the moment you finally decided to choose yourself? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one of them.